What would you think if I told you that your silence revealed more truth than your words ever did? That the moment you stopped being instantly available, the world would rearrange itself around you? And that people would finally show you who they really are? Today, perhaps more than ever, we live in a culture that has confused availability with worth, where instant replies have become the currency of care, where being perpetually present is mistaken for love itself. But what happens when you withdraw that availability? What happens when you step back from the endless performance of being needed? The answer might disturb you, because when you stop being constantly available, you don't just change your schedule. You transform your entire relationship with yourself and others. You move from a space of emotional bankruptcy to one of profound self-possession. And in that transformation, you discover something most people never will: the difference between being consumed and being remembered. Let me paint you a picture. You know this person. Maybe you are this person. She responds to texts within minutes, regardless of what she's doing. Her phone buzzes and she drops everything. A friend needs help at midnight? She's there. A colleague needs coverage on the weekend? Of course. Her calendar is everyone else's emergency contact. She has become what Carl Jung would recognize as the perpetual giver, not out of genuine generosity, but from a deeper, more desperate place. A place where her worth is measured by her usefulness, where love is earned through availability. This is the always available archetype, a pattern that has multiplied exponentially in our hyper-connected age. But here's what she doesn't realize. She's not being generous. She's being consumed. Every instant response is a small piece of her energy given away. Every dropped boundary is a fragment of her authentic self traded for temporary validation. She's building relationships on a foundation of utility rather than genuine connection. And the cruel irony? The more available she becomes, the less valued her presence actually is. Because when something is always accessible, it loses its preciousness. When someone always says yes, their yes becomes meaningless. There's a darker truth beneath this pattern of constant availability. It's rooted in what attachment theorists call the fear of abandonment, a primal terror that if we're not perpetually useful, we'll be forgotten, replaced, discarded. This fear creates what psychologists recognize as a codependent survival strategy. If I'm always there, I won't be abandoned. But this strategy is built on a fundamental misunderstanding. Availability was never love. It was fear dressed up as devotion. The person who can't say no, who can't create space, who can't allow silence, they're not loving more deeply. They're loving from a place of scarcity, from a belief that they must earn their place in other people's lives through constant service. This is what Jung called living in opposition to individuation, the process of becoming whole. Instead of moving toward their authentic self, they're moving away from it, piece by piece, response by response. They're performing a version of themselves that they think others will find indispensable. But performance, no matter how convincing, is exhausting. Our modern world has created something unprecedented in human history, a marketplace of emotional labor where presence becomes a commodity rather than a gift. Social media demands constant engagement. Workplaces expect 24/7 responsiveness. Relationships are measured by response times and read receipts. We've created a culture where being unavailable feels like a moral failing, where taking time to think before responding is seen as coldness, where protecting your energy is labeled as selfishness. But here's what this cultural programming doesn't tell you. This system doesn't create deeper connections. It creates emotional depletion on a mass scale. When everyone is always available, no one is truly present. When every moment is filled with response and reaction, there's no space left for reflection, for genuine feeling, for the deep inner work that creates authentic relationships. We've mistaken busyness for importance, reactivity for engagement, and constant availability for care. Then there's another pattern that emerges from this cultural pressure: the pleaser-performer. This person has made themselves indispensable through a carefully constructed identity of usefulness. They're the one everyone calls when they need something. The reliable friend, the go-to colleague, the family member who never says no. Their entire sense of self is built on being needed. But here's the trap. They've confused usefulness with love. They believe that if they stop being useful, they'll stop being loved. So they perform their worth through perpetual service, through constant availability, through the endless sacrifice of their own needs for others. And it works, until it doesn't. Because relationships built on utility are inherently unstable. When you're valued for what you do rather than who you are, you're always one no away from being disposable. The pleaser-performer lives in constant anxiety, knowing that their worth is contingent on their performance. They can never rest, never truly relax, because their value requires constant maintenance. They've created a prison of their own making, where love is earned rather than given, where acceptance is conditional rather than absolute. But what happens when someone finally steps back? When they stop responding instantly, stop saying yes to everything, stop performing their usefulness? This is where the withdrawn self emerges, and this is where the real transformation begins. At first, there's guilt. Enormous, crushing guilt. The person who's spent years being constantly available feels selfish for taking space. They feel guilty for not responding immediately. They feel like they're failing the people who depend on them. But if they can sit with this guilt, if they can resist the urge to immediately return to their pattern of overgiving, something remarkable happens. The silence starts to speak. People begin to reveal who they really are when they can no longer access you on demand. Some people respect your boundaries immediately. They understand that you're creating healthy space and they honor it. Others become angry, demanding, manipulative. They reveal that they never valued you. They valued your availability. They never loved you. They loved what you could do for them. This revelation is often painful, but it's also profoundly liberating. Because here's what most people never discover. Your silence reveals more truth than your words ever did. When you stop being constantly available, you create space for authentic relationships to emerge and inauthentic ones to fall away. The friend who only calls when they need something stops calling altogether. The family member who expects you to drop everything for their crisis gets angry when you don't. The colleague who relied on your constant availability starts looking for someone else to exploit. But the people who truly value you, they don't just respect your boundaries, they celebrate them. They understand that a person with boundaries is someone worth knowing. That energy protected is energy that can be given more meaningfully when it matters. This is the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole, integrated, authentically yourself. It's not about becoming selfish or uncaring. It's about caring from a place of fullness rather than emptiness. It's about giving from choice rather than compulsion. As the guilt begins to fade and the truth becomes clear, a new pattern emerges. The rebuilder. The rebuilder doesn't just withdraw. They consciously reconstruct their relationship with their own energy, their time, their presence. They begin to see their attention as sacred, their time as precious, their energy as finite and valuable. They stop apologizing for having needs. They stop over-explaining their decisions. They stop performing gratitude for being treated with basic respect. This isn't cruelty, it's clarity. The rebuilder understands something profound. You cannot give what you do not have. You cannot love others authentically if you haven't learned to love yourself enough to protect your own well-being. They begin to listen inward rather than outward. They start making decisions based on their own values rather than others' expectations. And in doing so, they discover something that had been buried under years of people-pleasing: their authentic self. But what happens to those who never make this shift? What happens to the person who remains perpetually available, constantly giving, endlessly performing their worth? The consequences are devastating. First comes emotional bankruptcy, a state where you've given so much of yourself away that you no longer know who you are beneath the performance. You become exhausted, resentful, and increasingly empty, but you can't stop giving because it's the only way you know how to maintain connection. Then comes the collapse of utility-based relationships. The moment you try to set any boundary, the moment you need support rather than giving it, these relationships crumble. Because they were never based on genuine care. They were based on what you could provide. Finally comes the erosion of selfhood itself. When your life becomes a constant reaction to others' needs, you lose touch with your own desires, dreams, and authentic voice. You become a ghost of yourself, moving through life serving others' agendas while your own remains undefined. This is the price of never learning to withdraw your availability. This is what happens when you mistake being needed for being loved. Of course, when you begin to withdraw your availability, you'll face resistance. Our culture has trained us to see boundaries as selfishness, unavailability as rejection, and self-protection as cruelty. You'll be called selfish for protecting your energy. You'll be labeled difficult for having needs. You'll be accused of not caring because you're no longer sacrificing yourself for others' convenience. But here's what you need to understand. This resistance isn't about you. It's about other people's discomfort with losing access to your emotional labor. When you stop being constantly available, you force others to confront their own relationship with boundaries, their own patterns of taking without giving, their own avoidance of personal responsibility. Your withdrawal becomes a mirror that shows them things they'd rather not see about themselves. And that's not your responsibility to manage. So you reach a moment of choice, a crossroads where two paths diverge completely. Path 1, stay available. Keep overgiving, chasing validation, losing energy and voice. Continue the performance of usefulness until you're completely depleted. Maintain relationships that drain you and wonder why you feel so empty despite being surrounded by people who need you. Path 2, withdraw and reclaim. Set boundaries, sit with silence, let the masks fall, and begin the profound work of individuation. The path back to your authentic center. The first path feels safer because it's familiar. It's what you've always done. It's what others expect from you. But it leads to a life that isn't really yours. The second path feels terrifying because it requires you to risk being disliked, misunderstood, even temporarily alone. But it leads to something most people never find: a life of authentic presence rather than performed availability. For those brave enough to choose the second path, something extraordinary begins to happen. As you protect your energy and create boundaries, as you stop over-explaining and over-apologizing, as you release the compulsion to be constantly useful, you begin to embody what Jung called the individuated self. This is the whole self, someone who no longer needs to perform their worth because they know it intrinsically. Someone who gives from abundance rather than scarcity. Someone who understands that their presence is a gift, not a given. The whole self doesn't respond instantly to every message because they understand that thoughtful response is more valuable than immediate reaction. They don't say yes to everything because they know that their selective yes makes their commitment meaningful. They don't apologize for having needs because they understand that healthy relationships require mutual care, not one-sided sacrifice. And something magnetic happens when someone embodies this energy. People are drawn to those who value themselves enough to create boundaries. Authentic relationships are built with those who respect rather than exploit your energy. Deep connections form with people who understand that presence is precious precisely because it's not always available. The whole self becomes unforgettable not because they're always there, but because when they are there, they're truly present. Here's the paradox that most people miss. The moment you stop being constantly available is the moment you become truly valuable. When your presence becomes selective, it becomes precious. When your attention becomes protected, it becomes meaningful. When your energy becomes sacred to you, it becomes sacred to others. This isn't about playing games or manipulating others. It's about understanding a fundamental truth. Anything that's always accessible loses its power to transform. The sun is powerful partly because night exists. Silence is meaningful because of sound. Your presence becomes magnetic when it's no longer guaranteed. This is why the people who learn to withdraw their availability often find that their relationships don't just survive. They become deeper, more authentic, more genuinely reciprocal. Because they're no longer attracting people who want to use them. They're attracting people who want to know them. Let me share something that might change how you see your own life. Your energy is not renewable. Your attention is not infinite. Your presence is not a resource to be mined by anyone who demands it. These are sacred aspects of your humanity, and treating them as disposable has consequences that extend far beyond your relationships. When you give your energy indiscriminately, you're not just harming yourself. You're teaching others that your well-being doesn't matter. You're modeling a relationship with the self that says, I exist to serve others' needs, regardless of my own. This modeling doesn't create healthy relationships. It creates cycles of exploitation that can span generations. But when you begin to treat your energy as sacred, when you protect your presence, guard your attention, and honor your need for space, you model something revolutionary. Self-respect. You show others what it looks like to value yourself enough to create boundaries. You demonstrate that healthy relationships require mutual consideration, not one-sided sacrifice. You become living proof that love doesn't require self-destruction. But why is this so difficult? Why do so many people find it nearly impossible to stop being constantly available, even when they recognize the cost? The answer lies in a fear so primal, so deeply embedded, that most people never consciously acknowledge it. The terror of being unloved, forgotten, or seen as selfish. This fear often has roots that go back to childhood, to early experiences that taught us our worth was contingent on our usefulness. Maybe we learned that love came with conditions. Maybe we discovered that being good meant never having needs of our own. These early lessons create survival strategies that follow us into adulthood, long after they've stopped serving us. The child who learned that love required perfect behavior becomes the adult who can't say no. The teenager who felt valued only for their achievements becomes the person who must constantly prove their worth through availability. The young person who is punished for having needs becomes someone who apologizes for existing. These patterns aren't character flaws. They're adaptations, survival mechanisms that once protected us but now imprison us. Understanding this doesn't excuse the pattern, but it does explain why changing it requires such courage. Because setting boundaries means confronting the deepest fear, that we might not be loved for who we are, separate from what we can provide. When you finally begin to withdraw your constant availability, your relationships become a revelation. Some people, the ones who truly care about you, will not only respect your boundaries, but will be relieved that you're finally protecting yourself. They'll tell you they were worried about how much you were giving. They'll celebrate your newfound self-respect. These relationships don't just survive your withdrawal of availability. They flourish because of it. Because when you stop giving from emptiness, you can begin giving from fullness. When you stop responding from obligation, you can start engaging from genuine desire. But other relationships will collapse entirely. And this collapse, though painful, is essential information. The person who gets angry when you don't respond immediately was never interested in your well-being. They were interested in your service. The friend who disappears when you stop being constantly available was never really a friend. They were a beneficiary of your overgiving. The family member who labels you selfish for having boundaries was never supporting your growth. They were depending on your depletion. This revelation can be devastating, but it's also liberating. Because you discover that you'd rather have a few authentic relationships than many exploitative ones. You learn that being alone is better than being surrounded by people who only value what you can do for them. We live in a time that has sold us a profound lie, that love requires self-destruction, that caring means being endlessly available, that healthy relationships are built on one person's perpetual sacrifice. This lie is everywhere, in our movies, our social media, our family dynamics, our workplace cultures. We've romanticized the person who gives until it hurts, who sacrifices their own needs for others, who never says no. But this romanticization serves a system that benefits from people who don't value themselves enough to create boundaries. It serves employers who want workers available at all hours. It serves family systems that depend on one person's emotional labor. It serves friends who want support without reciprocity. The cultural celebration of endless availability isn't about love. It's about exploitation made socially acceptable. And when you begin to see this clearly, when you recognize how deeply this programming runs, you start to understand why withdrawing your availability feels so radical. Because it is radical. In a culture that profits from your depletion, self-protection becomes a revolutionary act. So what does this transformation actually look like? It doesn't happen overnight. It's not a simple decision to just set boundaries. It's a gradual process of remembering who you are beneath the performance of usefulness. It starts with small acts of unavailability. Not responding to non-urgent messages immediately. Taking time to consider requests before automatically saying yes. Creating pockets of time that belong entirely to you. At first, this feels impossible. Your nervous system, trained to equate unavailability with danger, will flood you with anxiety. You'll feel guilty, selfish, wrong.